she did not have proof for the claim, but my father's opposition and the masses at large would create a very big scandal of the issue. My father immediately reminded my mother of the document she signed and the implications involved if she broke the agreement. My mother looked at her sister with tears in her eyes and asked how she could betray her. Her sister's tears didn't affect Aunt Mabel at all. She refused to answer the question, and my dad, seeming annoyed by our presence, told us to leave his house. As we turned to go, Aunt Mabel mentioned that their wedding was already set, but we weren't invited. Then she said we had only a day to leave her house. My mom and I went back to my aunt's place and quickly packed our things. We moved into an apartment we had rented earlier. The wedding between my aunt and my father is in a few days, and the date for the election's not far ahead. We're waiting for the whole thing to be over so my aunt can at least get what she deserves. Update number 1. My father secretly updated my mother and me about the state of things with Aunt Mabel. He would sometimes send us audio recordings of their conversation or a video when it was possible. I understood he was doing that to make us see he had nothing to hide anymore. Well, they both had their court marriage without any guest, and there was no party. My father, however, promised to throw this recent bride the most extravagant party she had ever witnessed in all her days. Once the elections were over, of course, Aunt Mabel immediately sent images of their court wedding to my mother and a bid to get her further upset. I must say at this point that my mother is quite a lady. To have agreed to let her husband live with her sister as her husband and wife, even if it was fake. My father had to temporarily play the part of a husband, which usually involves sleeping with our. There's no way that he could avoid that, as it could make his wife suspicious. Out of nowhere, she started posting on social media about how her life was getting better and better because she found the perfect guy. People on her friend list began asking who the lucky guy was and why they weren't invited to her wedding. Aunt Mabel hinted that she'd update them soon about her plans to get married. The election finally happened, and my father, well, he lost. Yeah, it's sad because we had sacrificed a lot to help him become victorious, and upon seeing that her husband had lost the election, Aunt Mabel cannot wait for him to mourn his loss. She immediately starts asking him about when they would host the wedding party, as she can no longer keep people in the dark about their lives. But my father told her he had just lost the election and could not start planning a wedding party right after Aunt Mabel ignored what my father was saying. And she decides to force his hand into making the whole thing public. So she posts this image of the both of them standing together and holding what seemed like a marriage certificate. The image got some reactions from most of her friends who knew my father was her sister's husband. They asked for some kind of explanation, and my aunt commented that my father, was her soulmate. I saw the post on my aunt's Facebook timeline as I was keeping tabs on her, and I brought it to my mother's attention, who in turn notified my father. My dad asked his wife why she rushed to share information before him. Aunt Mabel said, "Elections are done, no need to wait." Dad felt sad, but Aunt Mabel warned she'd leave him if he didn't celebrate. If they split, Dad might lose half his stuff, and Mom might get a share, leaving him with much less than he expected. My father had to reassure Aunt Mabel that he was not angry. She had posted their wedding picture, but he just wanted them to take it one step at a time. He then promised to throw that party in 3 days, but he had something else in mind from what my aunt expected. While my aunt expected to be parade, that's the wife of my father. My father would use the party to refute claims that they were married and expose her for who she was and publicly admit an apology. Ice to my mom for cheating on her. Update number 2. Things have gone bad, like super bad. The planned party would no longer be held because the party's host was dead. Yes, you heard me correctly. My father's dead. My mom and I have not heard from him. As the days of the intended party drew close, and each time I called his phone, it was direct to voicemail. It was via the media that we learned my father had been involved in an accident and was fighting for his life at the hospital. I called my aunt to confirm the news, but she was not responding. My mom and I rushed to Aunt Mabel's place, hoping for some clarity, but she wasn't around, which deepened our worry. That absence confirmed our fears about Dad. Luckily, Dad had a regular doctor, making it easier for us to find the hospital where he was admitted. Arriving there, we discovered Dad had been in the hospital for 3 days already, adding to the shock of not knowing about his condition earlier. My mother asked my aunt why she would keep the information from us, and my aunt replied by saying she did not tell us, because it was not our business. My mother did not want to make a scene right then and there, as the important thing was for her husband, who was comatose, to recover. She asked the doctor for an update on my father's situation, but the doctor noted he cannot do that. And so my aunt, who was thought to be my father's wife, had not given the go-ahead to divulge the information. So my mother tried persuading the doctor to keep us updated, with the claim that we're all one family. So we reached out to my stepmom to seek her confirmation and permission, as it was against their professional ethics, to divulge a patient's info to some other people. Aunt Mabel refused to give the doctors permission to share information, shutting down my mom's request without hesitation. Mom couldn't hold back and started making a scene, insisting on our family's rights. Things got tense, and the doctor had security escort us out, but Mom wasn't done. She was determined to go back. We were actually preparing to return to the hospital this morning when I got a notification from Facebook. It was about a post which my aunt had made. I curiously opened it, of course, and it was a tribute to my father and Guys. My head absolutely began to spin as I read the words and saw the condolences of friends. And I showed my mother, and she just ran out of the house, frantically looking for a taxi to take to the hospital. We got to the hospital, and my father was not at the ward. She asked the nurses, and they noted that my father passed away yesterday. I felt as though the world should just come to an end. My mother nearly cried her eyes out, and we're currently at home, and my mother's sleeping after spending hours and hours crying. I don't know what we're going to do right now. Update number 3. Hey guys, my mom and I just went to the house 5 days after we learned of my father's death because we needed to put our heads together with my aunt to make plans for the burial. There were sympathizers already in the house when we walked in. My aunt, who was supposed to be mourning, did not look like us the moment she saw us. Aunt Mabel made it crystal clear that she didn't want our sympathy. Mom, though, couldn't hold back and began confronting her. She first criticized Aunt Mabel for not informing us about Dad's passing, then clarified that we weren't there for sympathy but to organize Dad's funeral. That's when Aunt Mabel dropped a bomb, bluntly stating that our connection with Dad ceased when she divorced him and I moved out. I immediately told her that my father, though separated from my mother, was still my father. But what my Aunt Mabel said next caused a bit of a stir. Aunt Mabel noted that we had wasted our time coming to the house because my father was already buried. My mom and I both felt it was a joke, but Aunt Mabel insisted that my father be buried at the cemetery in the morning the very next day. How could she have my dad buried almost immediately after his death? It was as though she had to put the resources in place and just waited till he died. She had no right to make such a decision without informing us. My mother rushed at her with the kind of rage that I've never seen before. Sympathizers had to rescue my aunt from my mother's wrath, and Aunt Mabel had the both of us thrown out of the house. My mom made it clear to Aunt Mabel that this wasn't the end and called her a thief, accusing her of trying to claim things she didn't deserve. Aunt Mabel threatened to get a restraining order, but that didn't scare my mom and me. Then, surprisingly, Aunt Mabel showed up at our doorstep last week. She seemed confused, mentioning that she couldn't reach Dad's lawyer for some reason and insisted that both my mom and I be there for the will reading. She noted that she did not see the need for our presence because I had nothing to inherit. She spoke with such confidence like she had written the will herself for her life. She was there when my father wrote it. The mere fact that she was pushing to have the will read so soon was a pointer that she had always wanted my dad's empire for herself. My mother told her sister that my father and this lawyer must have had their reasoning for insisting we be present while the will was read, and we would honor the request. Final update. I know I lost my father a few months ago, and I'm supposed to be sober still, but we just got back at my aunt, and it feels great. The day of the will came, and my mother and I showed up. The lawyer was already there, and my aunt asked that he hurry up with the process so we could all leave her house. The lawyer said my late father had apportioned his property to his wife and son. Aunt Mabel immediately questioned what the lawyer had sat, and she began ranting that my father could not possibly have shared his property between her and me. The lawyer's first words stirred up Aunt Mabel's anger, but the next revelation hit her even harder. He mentioned that she wasn't even mentioned as the wife in the will. Her name wasn't anywhere in Dad's will. That news made my mom and me burst out laughing together. Aunt Mabel couldn't handle it. She accused the lawyer of being shady and collaborating with us. In frustration, she demanded that all of us leave her house. But the lawyer called to her attention that she'd had just a few weeks to vacate the premises. As my mom and I were the legal owners, my aunt promised to challenge the will in court. But before then, and you know what she did? We all found ourselves in court with my aunt trying to disprove the will. She claimed that my mother and I somehow altered the actual will because my late father would not overlook her to name my mother, whom he had divorced in his will. My mother called to the judge's attention that she was not divorced from my father, and the judge had to ask God to be able to produce proof of her claim. And Mabel produced her marriage certificate to my father and his divorce certificate from me. My mother equally presented her wedding certificate to the judge. The judge looked at the documentation and noted that both wedding certificates were real, but that of the divorce was not authentic. The lawyer dropped a bombshell on Aunt Mabel, revealing that since my parents were never officially divorced, Her marriage to my father wasn't legally recognized in the country. This meant she had no right to claim herself as his wife. He demanded that she leave the house right away and refrain from claiming any of the properties my father left behind, as they had nothing to do with her. The judge finally added icing to the cake by asking my stepmother to pay a certain amount in damages and demanded she put out a public statement where she informed the public that she was not the wife of my father. Aunt Mabel knew at once that she had been played and she left in shame. My mother and I helped her out, you know. We threw our crap out and it was so satisfying. Now, you'd agree with me that Aunt Mabel has got exactly what she deserved, right? I mean, I have not seen a story like it. This one was crazy. The aunt, not only was she so related to Opie and the fact that, well, it was Opie's aunt, she went behind her sister's back, stole her man. And I just wish I knew what election we were talking about so I could get a little scoop on this story. I just can't believe that Opie would have to go through such a situation. And the audacity from someone blood related just blew my mind. I want to hear from you guys what you thought about this story.